Today, inshallah, as we are moving on with our readings in the first muqaddimah of Ibn Juzay's Tafsir, we have come to Al-Bab al-Thamin fi Jawami al-Qira'at. And this is not the first encounter with the topic of Qira'at. So just to recap for you and to remind you where you can find those previous discussions. So this page that we're on now is page 106. Okay, so before that, we've seen a mention of Qira'at in the fourth bab, which is here on page 76, where he says, وَأَمَّا الْقِرَاءَاتِ فَإِنَّهَا فِي الْقُرْآنِ بِمَنْزِلَةِ الرِّوَايَةِ فِي الْحَدِيثِ. Okay, we have a special guest today, who is Sheikh Salman bin Nasir, and I will introduce him a bit better in a minute. But it's to help just to recap some of these issues and help to clarify some of what Ibn Juzayy is saying in the current chapter that I've invited him to join us. And I'm very glad that he was able to do so. So this is one of the ibarat that I'll probably ask you about, Sheikh Salman. That's why I suddenly jumped to mention you. بمنزلة الرواية في الحديث فلا بد من ضبطها كما يضبط الحديث بروايته. Okay, so then we saw already this categorization, which is going to repeat in our current chapter, between the mashhura and the shadha. Okay, the mashhura, which is referring to as the seven and things of its like. And then he mentions these two in particular, Yaqub ibn Muhaysin. In the chapter we're about to read, he also mentions one more. Okay, وَالشَّاذَّةُ مَا سِوَى ذَلِكَ. Okay, so that was our first encounter with Ibn Juzay's discussion of Qira'at. So you can find that in the video, which is marked 4A, and that's from 45 minutes in, right? If you want to go back and see what we said at that point. But we actually said more a bit later when we were here on page 84, Al-Bab al-Khamis, where it was about Asbab al-Khilaf fi Tafsir, right? Or Bayn al-Mufassirin. So the first, he mentioned Ikhtilaf al-Qira'at, which I think is actually a really thoughtful way of talking about it, because in the first place, before you can get into the matter of interpretation or doing i'rab of it, you just need to have an agreement about which text, which specific version of the text are we talking about, which variant of the text are we talking about. So if there is difference between the readers, and there's difference between the Mufassirin on which reading that they're actually looking about and talking about, looking at and talking about, then there's going to be ikhtilaf maybe from that level, right? Even though not all qira'at actually have an effect on meaning. It's just that conceptually, that would be the first stage of establishing agreement or disagreement, right? So at that point, we actually talked at a bit more length. So that's in the video, which is called 5, and it was from 4.5 minutes in, you know, and it was a good sort of lengthier point. But now we came to the main.
If you'll allow me,
Yes,
there's actually there's an interesting point here. It's worth being aware of when you're reading tafsir, particularly with the early tafsirs. You see this very clearly. It's like so you'll see it, for example, with Tafsir al-Tabri, you'll see it very clearly that when he mentions that there's different opinions for the interpretation of a particular verse, sometimes what you'll find is that those different opinions are actually a reflection of different qira'at. And so he will actually very clearly link that those who interpreted it this way, they did so because they read the verse this way. And those who interpreted it this way, they did so because they read the verse this way. And in some cases, that might even extend to, well, Fulan from the Sahaba or Fulan from the Tabi'een interpreted this verse this way because he read it in this particular way, which might even be an obscure qira'ah, which goes altogether outside of the 7 qira'at and altogether outside of the 10 qira'at. And so you have to sort of be paying attention when you're reading tafsir that a particular mufassir might be explaining a verse a certain way. Don't just assume that, oh, this is just another opinion in interpreting the verse. It might be that this opinion is actually explaining a particular qira'ah, and so you need to be cognizant of that when you read books of tafsir. And sometimes that can get a little bit mixed up. The presentation might not be entirely clear. What is the relationship between certain qira'at and certain interpretations? So that's actually a very, very important point when you're reading tafsir, that you need to understand the relationship between the tafsir and the qira'at.
Absolutely. And because I didn't do anything close to Haqq of Sheikh Salman, of course, you picked up that he's American. MashaAllah, he is based in Mecca. He is graduated there from Al-Qura University. He's, I think, just in the finishing stage of his master's, if not already finished, inshallah. And he has the blessing of having studied and continues to study with some major scholars, not only in the field of Quran and Tafsir specifically, which is something which is hard to find these days, people who actually are studying with those specialists, but of course also in other fields, especially hadith and fiqh, mashallah. So I made sure to have him on board because, you know, I really respect not only his knowledge, but his readings and his awareness also of how we need to frame these issues and clarify them, where some confusion might arise. Now, many of you might be aware that there has been a bunch of discussion recently about Qira'at, and some questions raised about, okay, how does that connect to our understanding of the preservation of the Quran? Is there some concern about the status of the Qira'at and the status of the Quran resultant from that? Is it the case that there could be, you know, I need to clarify the question of the Qira'at being mutawatira or not mutawatira in entirety and things like this. So the circumstances around that are not necessarily the best. It would be great if someone had written a really thorough book or a strong argument, which then we could agree with things, disagree with things. But what's happened is, you know, certain discussions have taken place, you know, almost that spilled out of some discussions that were happening in maybe in private circles of knowledge. Maybe things have been said in some here and there in interviews and talks. And then a lot of people are chiming in, and sometimes people chiming in, their intentions are very good and they want to clarify things, but at the same time, their own conception of the matter might not be as complete as it needs to be in order to create a sort of correct understanding. The way I would like to put this, just to try and keep things straightforward, is that in a way you've got most of the Muslims are at a certain level of awareness when it comes to the existence of multiple qira'at. And that is that they are pretty much not aware that this is a thing, right, that it exists. And that's fine, to be honest, like most people don't have to know that. But what happens is that it affects their way of seeing the Quran, right? So they see the Quran as something which is read in one way, and therefore there's one correct way to read it. And that's compounded by sometimes maybe some of our preachers and you know, du'at have sometimes said certain statements like this, where they say, you know, you can travel the entire globe and you will not find one vowel or one letter different in anyone's Quran. Which, you know, when that sort of becomes very firm in your mind, if you're exposed just to the existence of multiple qira'at, you would be shocked by that and you would find this something confusing. And I remember that myself. Like, I remember the first time I came across that, I was on a plane journey, I don't know where, and you know, there was some Abdul Basit playing in the, you know, the plane has a radio thing, and I was listening on that, and then all of a sudden he was sitting, and I was looking around like, can anyone hear what I'm hearing? They can't because I've got headphones on, but I was like, he just made the biggest mistake. Like, but this is Abdul Basit, isn't it? Like, how could he possibly?
Does he not know tajweed?
Does he not? Did he not even learn the basics of it? So it shocked me at the time. Like, he's something. How could he make a mistake, right? But that's because I was on this level of awareness, which some people had also placed me on. Like this, so they taught me to see the Quran in that way. So when I saw the Quran in that way, just an awareness of the existence of Qira'at was a threat to that. Okay, so let's say then there's a higher plane where many of the scholars exist, where, you know, they're explaining things that there are multiple qira'at, but we have to appreciate qira'at are not random. They're a finite set of you know, variations. They are very carefully compiled, and they are based on sound scholarship. They are based on isnad. They are based on following the rasm, the shared writing of the Quran. And also they go back to a reality at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, which is that there was even multiplicity at that time. And that's represented by the fact we have these hadiths which talk about the 7 ahruf. Okay, I'll ask Sheikh Salman to give us a good synopsis of this in a minute, inshallah. But basically, when you appreciate that, it comes from something intended. It is part of the way that revelation came, that there are multiple ahruf, there are multiple ways of reciting. And then there are scholars who have compiled and just minutely analyzed, how these things are recited and the chains of them, such that you can say that when we recite according to any of these qira'at, we are reciting the Quran. We can have full confidence in that. We know that this is coming from the Prophet ﷺ. We know this is coming from revelation. Okay, so that is all fine on a basic level. This is, if you like, supposed to be the answer to that low-level ignorance. However, there are some things in this account, right, which have a certain amount of oversimplification in it. They have a certain amount of, let's say, papering over certain things or details which themselves, people on this level can also find a bit discomforting, right? So that's where these kind of current rumblings have happened, is that, this kind of statement that I'm saying at this middle level exists even, it's something which has become a sort of well-established way of talking about things. Some specifics of that don't necessarily find their way supported all the way back in our tradition. Some specifics of that, some ways of expressing it don't always find their way, that Muslims have not always seen it in exactly that way. I'll allow Sheikh Salman to interject.
If you let me interject. Basically, just to sort of sum up what you said and sort of give my perspective on it. Just sort of to reframe the discussion and maybe to explain it in a different way. So maybe it'll be, hopefully, with more than one different explanation, it might get a little bit clearer what was being said. So generally, we have like the general masses of Muslims who are not aware that there's such a thing called Qira'at. So, for example, I open the Mus'haf and I read it, and it has these markings, the dots and the vowel markings. And I learned to read it that way, and maybe I learned to read it that way from my mother or from a Hafiz Saab who came to teach me Quran at home. And so this is what I know to be the Quran. And I think that's probably the majority of Muslims in the world. The majority of Muslims in the world are like that. That all what they know is that, well, this is like this. And so they don't realize that the original Masahif that were written by the Sahaba were written without any of the, in the time of Uthman, were written without any of these markings. There was no dots. There was no vowel markings. In fact, most people would be shocked that in a significant part of the Muslim world, Morocco, I think maybe I don't remember which ones recite Warsh and which ones recite Qalun, but a significant portion of Al-Maghrib Al-Arabi reads the reading of Warsh. And Masahif that are written according to the reading of Warsh actually are written in a drastically different way, meaning instead of one dot and two dots to differentiate the fa and the qaf, you have one dot on top and one dot on the bottom. And so I think for the majority of Muslims, if they were to realize that there's a vast portion of the ummah, millions of people who their Masahif, if they were to open them up, they wouldn't understand what in the world is going on here. What is this fa with the dot underneath it? So obviously, the vast majority of Muslims, they have a very limited understanding of this is what the Quran is. They know that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and it's here in my hand, and that's it. So there's a big gap that's sort of missing there in sort of their understanding of what is there. Then you have people who I think perhaps at various levels have some sort of general education about the Quran and about the history of the Quran. So they're aware that there are 7 Qira'at, they're aware that there are 10 Qira'at. They might even be confused, what's the difference between the 7 Qira'at and the 10 Qira'at? But they're aware that they exist. Maybe they know the names of some of the Qurra. Now, thanks to YouTube, they've probably heard more of those Qira'at. than back when when I was young or when you were young. It was probably for you, as you said, it was the first time you heard it was on the airplane listening to Abdul Basit, and you're like, what is this? For me, I think the first time I heard a qira'ah that was not Hafs and Asim was in my local masjid. A brother who actually used to live in our community and then had moved away, and was actually he had isnad for some qira'at. He came back and so we put him forward to lead the prayer, and he just started reading. I guess he was reading Warsh. He just started reading Warsh, and so by this time I'd actually studied some tajweed, and I'm thinking, this brother's tajweed was really good. What happened to him? And I'm just so a lot of people are not aware of these things. You reach a point where you become aware of these things if you go to a seminary, and particularly if you study, specialize in, say, in ulum al-Quran, going to Qira'at al-Quran or Tafsir or what have you, or you go into a Qira'at program, whether that's in a university or outside of university, you go to a sheikh and you do talaqi of the Qira'at, you will learn the basics about this topic. But not, I said the basics. Now if you learn the Qira'at, al-Qira'at al-Sab' or al-Qira'at al-Ashr, you will obviously memorize those in considerable detail. But even then, when it comes to studying the historical development of this topic, you won't necessarily go into these things in depth. You will basically read maybe a standard textbook, which goes into these things. And when you read a textbook, you don't actually realize that, well, across 1400 years of tradition, some of the things that are in the textbook that you're learning and that you're being taught and that your teachers were taught as well, or is generally being taught in most seminaries, that there's actually ikhtilaf on it amongst ulama throughout the Torah. And it's a very big tradition if you consider that it spans 14 centuries. It's natural that across 14 centuries you have a host of works. Just from say the 4th century and 5th century, we have something like 50 published works on Qira'at, and these are the earliest works dedicated works on multiple Qira'at to reach us. And so that's just from that. We're literally talking about 1,000 years ago. That's nothing to say of the works that have been published, that were written since then, that are published. And again, I'm just talking about the works that are published. If we talk about the ones that are unpublished and are either still in manuscript form or simply did not survive, there's even more than that. So I mean, this is a very vast tradition. So just having gone through that process and having studied a few standard textbooks does not mean you're an expert. And I don't claim to be an expert either. I've just dug more into these things than people normally do. So I know more about it than people ordinarily would do, but I'm not an expert because I haven't read all of I haven't spent a lifetime of actual specialization researching all of these works. And it's a very vast tradition. So it's not easy to make a claim that it's like this, especially on things where when you look through the tradition, you find that actually scholars have disagreed in considerable detail.
Yeah. So I think that's why we're maybe hinting towards the fact that, okay, when I'm trying to illustrate with these sort of levels, there's this, and then there's a higher level which is very, is full of correct things, but there might be some things that do require some reevaluation, some improvement. To look at the Quran really as it should be seen in a way that matches up with the historical information. Bearing in mind the historical information is Islamic information. It is the Muslim
and I think the key here is that people don't realize that studying certain textbooks means that you are now familiar with this topic. It doesn't mean that you're an expert on this topic.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of people, they get lost.
And so like similarly to how we've been pointing towards various times, we're looking at tafsir, we're talking about usul al-tafsir. The general point that I've been trying to get across in some of my lessons and through my PhD thesis and things like that is, the reality, the materials are there. But sometimes what's needed is to consolidate that, make a bit better sense of it, organize it clearly, and update it based on
Analyze
the
it.
best information that we have. First and foremost, the information in our own traditional books, our own scholars, the experts of Qira'at, for example, like now switching back to our current topic, those who compiled the Qira'at, the way that they talked, what they actually recorded, those who looked at the Masahif and what they actually said about it. So many things that are there in our tradition that just, they have been, in a sense, some accounts have been made to gather that information and present it. But if there are some things that can be improved upon, that's really what we're looking for. Just the next update in explaining that, right? So at the current time, there probably isn't a book, either in Arabic, let alone in English, that we could say, this one, is the standout, account in the issue.
Final word, and it covers everything.
Yeah, so at the moment, there's a number of scholars, researchers who are looking at it. Maybe each has got their own preference or way of looking at it, but there's a need for the scholarship just to be, to give it a fresh boost of life, I would put it that way. And that's the way scholarship is. People will put something forward and it can be accepted, it can be critiqued, it can be improved. That's the way scholarship should always be. So, our primary, central concern here is to see how Qira'at are interacting with Tafsir, because our Imam, our Musannif, Ibn Juzayy rahmatullah alayhi, is talking about Qira'at. He's put that as part of, the initial explanation in the beginning of his book, and then he goes on to use them as we will see. And for those who've already been studying with me, that we already have seen to a certain extent how he refers to those qira'at. So we can see that there's a lot of, it's just a comfortable subject really for Mufassirin. Ibn Juzayy is coming after the period when it has been established that there's something called the 7 qira'at. So that is a very comfortable thing to see them as these are the canonical readings. And yet he is also open to qira'at beyond the 7, right, which he names here in this discussion. So let's read a little bit, and then we'll probably need to have a little bit of background about how we got to this situation of 7 qira'at and the shawad. But let's read a little bit so we've got something to work off.
الباب الثامن في جوامع القراءات، وهي على نوعين: مشهورة وشاذة. فالمشهورة القراءات 7، وهي حرف نافع المدني، وابن كثير المكي، وأبي عمرو بن العلاء البصري، وابن عامر الشامي، وعاصم وحمزة والكسائي الكوفيين. ويجري مجراهم في الصحة والشهرة يعقوب الحضرمي، وابن محيصن، ويزيد بن القعقاع. والشاذة ما سوى ذلك، وإنما سميت شاذة لعدم استفاضتها في النقل، وقد تكون فصيحة اللفظ وقوية المعنى.
Okay, so I'll take a little pause here, because just after that he goes on to talk about the 3 conditions.
Right.
Or in fact, maybe it's worth just taking the 3 conditions while we're at it, so that we hear his discussion.
ولا يجوز أن يقرأ بحرف إلا ب3 شروط: موافقته لمصحف عثمان بن عفان رضي الله عنه، وموافقته لكلام العرب ولو على بعض الوجوه أو في بعض اللغات، ونقله نقلا متواترا أو مستفيضا. واعلم أن اختلاف القراء على نوعين: أصول.
Okay, so after that it's more practical. So before that it's conceptual, defining what are the readings that are canonical, that are Quranic, next to others which are not deemed on the same level and not deemed as being Quran, right? In terms of the translation, I'm not so sure that by Jawami al-Qira'at he means something on the collections of the readings. I assume that by Jawami al-Qira'at he means something like on the general principles that apply to the readings. But maybe upon reading the chapter we'll get a better idea about that. So as he says that there are 2 types. So typically the terminology that we would hear about this is we've got the Qira'at Mutawatira and the Shadda. So that's become the famous wording, right? And the wording that's most commonly found in books, at least nowadays. As I understand, Sheikh Salman can correct me if I'm wrong. Going back further, you would more often find the word mashhura. It's it's something that is
Right.
established from early
Go back,
authors as well.
if you go back early enough, okay, just very briefly, the standardization of the 7 qira'at, as you're well aware, begins with Ibn Mujahid's book. It's known as typically known as Kitab al-Sab'a. It has a long title, but it's typically known as Kitab al-Sab'a. He is the one who did what is called in Arabic Tasbi' al-Sab'a, which literally would translate into Arabic as the sevenization of the 7. But Orientalists refer to this as the canonization of the 7 qira'at. So this starts with Ibn Mujahid in the early 4th century. We're talking about the early 300s. I think he dies in about 324 or so. And so, he produces his book in this period. After that, the 7 become the most common standard qira'at, and this becomes a pretty universal thing not long after. So if you look at the works of Qira'at that have reached us, there were actually works written before him. Some of the important works that were written before Ibn Mujahid that were major works were by Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Sallam, who's from the 3rd century. I think he dies in 220 something. Abu Hatim al-Sijistani, who dies in 240 something. I'm sorry, I don't have the dates. Abu Hatim al-Sijistani has a very important work as well. At-Tabari, who's actually a teacher of Ibn Mujahid, has a very important work as well, which he refers to in his Tafsir, but these works are lost. So the first major work to reach us is Ibn Mujahid, although we have smaller works that from an earlier period. But in terms of dedicated works of Qira'at, the first major one to reach us is Ibn Mujahid. And then in the 4th century and 5th century, there are a number of works that have been published. Sheikh Musaid al-Tayyar actually has a very nice paper that he's written, where he surveyed all of the published works that are sort of dedicated to Qira'at from this era, the 4th century to the 5th century. And one of the very important conclusions he came out with was that the term tawatur is nowhere present. Once or twice it actually comes up in some of these works, but it comes up in an incidental fashion, unrelated to the actual discussion about how qira'at are assessed. So tawatur is not a term that they use for qira'at. They will use different terms. And so you find discussion about them being mashhura, you find discussion about them being mustafida. Sometimes when you have a large group of qurra agreeing on the same qira'ah, or the vast majority of them are agreeing on a single qira'ah, it will be referred to as al-qira'atul amma or qira'atul jumhur, and various terms like this. So the concept of shuhra is there, the concept of istifada is there. The concept of tawatur as such does not come into play. Whether as a term, the term is not really used, nor does the concept of tawatur as in the usuli sense, it doesn't really come into play in the way that they're assessing Qira'at. This is in the dedicated works of Qira'at. But in that period, you begin to have usuliyin using the concept of tawatur in discussing Qira'at. So for example, one of the very early usuliyin is Imam al-Juwayni. He's not extremely early, but amongst the early Imams, he's a 5th century scholar, so in the same period that we're talking about. He's very not dependent, but his works are very much deeply influenced by al-Baqillani. Al-Baqillani is instrumental in popularizing the idea of the qira'at being mutawatir. Al-Juwayni, who's not an expert in qira'at, follows him on this. And what's interesting is that a later Maliki scholar in his commentary on Al-Burhan, Al-Abiyari, actually challenges him on this. He says, this is not right. Qira'at are not mutawatir. But nonetheless, the predominant trend becomes first in the books of usul, qira'at are discussed as being mutawatir. You get some pushback from some of these commentators, but eventually this becomes becomes the the more widespread view amongst the books of Qira'at as well at a later stage. And the exact history of that is not entirely clear to me. It's still something that requires further investigation. But one thing, yes, sorry.
Just to say that, so what we see in his discussion, he mentions tawatur as if like that's the, the expectation, the
right.
we'd expect it to be mutawatir, but it might not be mutawatir, but still accepted if it's close to that.
If it's not mutawatir. And that's actually interesting for a number of reasons. One thing that happens is that later scholars, and also you'll find this sometimes contemporary researchers, who adopt the view that qira'at are mutawatir, or that they have to be mutawatir in order to be acceptable. What they will do is they'll say, oh, early scholars who said mashhura, they meant mutawatir because they weren't using the term mutawatir. Here, he's eliminated that possibility. He's made very clear that, no, I'm saying they're mutawatir or mustafid, and it's not the same. So he calls them mashhura, he doesn't call them mutawatir. He explains that in terms of its transmission, there's two levels. There's transmission at the level of tawatur, and there's transmission at the level of istifada. So he's made very clear it's not the same. And the other thing that really kills the possibility of making ta'wil of his word, because a lot of the contemporary researchers who like to write papers on these topics, when they run into these sorts of quotes that are inconvenient for them, they say, oh, mashhura, that just means mutawatir here. Here, he's eliminated that possibility, not just here, but also in the earlier discussion that I think that was in chapter 4, where he compared the naqal of qira'at to dabt al-hadith.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he clearly is going out of his way to say, do not misinterpret what I'm saying. I am not saying that they're mutawatira. I'm saying that they're mashhura. They might be partly mutawatir, so some of it will be transmitted with tawatur, and that would be, for example, where pretty much you find all of the Qurra agreeing, goes without a doubt that that's mutawatir. But then you'll have levels that are less than that, and that's so basically what he's saying is that's fine as long as it's mustafida. As long as it's mustafida and the Qurra have accepted it, that is enough.
So yeah, I think just maybe at this point, just to avoid sort of a shubha coming in people's minds, so that we can clarify that tawatur exists for the Quran, right? There's a difference between saying tawatur of the Quran and then tawatur necessarily of every variant reading, right? So also that's another thing that we should clarify in terms of terminology, right? When we say a qira'ah, or when any imam is perhaps referring to such and such qira'ah, right? In some situations, he's talking about what we can call the reading compilation, right? We was discussing with Sheikh Salman, how do we describe this, right? So a compiled reading. What was the other term that you suggested?
Reading system.
A reading system, right? So that's where you can say the reading of Asim, right? As a whole, right? As a collection of choices made across, right?
Basically, the whole of this.
Right, in the specifics of how it is, voweled, and the specifics of letters and vowels, right? Other than that, of course, within it you've got a rasm, which allows for different possibilities. So first of all, that rasm, the Uthmanic recension or the Uthmanic codex, however the Orientalists want to put it. You called me an Orientalist earlier because I was saying canonical. So that is agreed upon without any doubt or any since Uthman, it is a matter of tawatur, isn't it? So there's that. And then there's the majority of when the Qurra are reading it, they're reading it in the same way. It's just occasionally they're varying between each other, right? So then also everything that they agree on, by necessity, you would not have any question in your mind that it's mutawatir. Then when they are disagreeing with each other about, they have divergence in how they're pronouncing a certain word, even then, so most of the time, of course, it's nothing to do with meaning, it's just purely pronunciation. So even if you might have a question, is the imala in this word is mutawatir or not? I mean, it doesn't really seem a very high stakes question in the first place to get really in a tussle about. Where it would become a question is, okay, so what about when there is a change in the meaning that's affected by a different vowel or even a different consonant because of where the dots are, according to the rasm. So even then, I mean, on one level, there's always tawatur in terms of like there's a closed system of variants, right? So
Right.
I'm sure this is inshallah a bad example, but let's say Malik and Malik. I'm pretty sure we could say Malik is mutawatir and Malik is mutawatir, and there wouldn't really be any. You can disagree if you want, but that would be straightforward, I think. But even if you were unsure about this point, you would know that the reading of Malik or Malik, there is tawatur here on this regard, that all the Muslims are in agreement about it. We have beside that, various other alternative readings that have been narrated and didn't make it into the canon. So
let me just comment on that example. That's actually a good example. You have Maliki Yawmiddin and Maliki Yawmiddin. These are the two well-known recitations and these are the only two recitations that are present in Qira'at al-Ashr for this verse. In fact, if we look at the whole of Surah Al-Fatiha, this is the only significant difference, which is not strictly a reflection of different pronunciations, because obviously the Arabs had different dialects, just like in any language today you have different dialects, and so they would pronounce different words in a different fashion. So in Surah Al-Fatiha, the only word where there's a difference in Al-Qira'at al-Ashr is here. Okay. Outside of Al-Qira'at al-Ashr, there's another reading here. For example, Malika Yawmiddin. Malika Yawmiddin with Fatha.
I think you're also Malaka Yawmiddini as well.
Malaka Yawmiddin is also reported. There's actually other things that are reported, but I just wanted to use this as an example.
Yeah.
Malaka Yawmiddin, I think, is I don't actually remember offhand now, so I don't want to speak. I think Malaka is reported from Abu Hanifa, but at the same time, there is discussion that the Qira'ah there was actually a book that was written compiling a Qira'ah from Abu Hanifa that was said to be fabricated. So I think this might actually be from that. So it's not it's not even properly. It may very well not even be properly attested from the actual Qur'an. But Malika, it seems, is Malika Yawmiddin. Some of them actually read Malika Yawmiddin. At-Tabari, when he speaks about this verse in his Tafsir, he says, look, you can read this way or you can read this way. And then he discusses what he thinks is the most appropriate reading, and he gives his reasoning why he says that. He says Malika Yawmiddin is the best recitation. And he gives his reasoning for it. And he mentions arguments for those who prefer Maliki Yawmiddin, and he responds to those arguments. But then when it comes to Malika Yawmiddin, he says this is not permissible to read at all. Why? Because all of the authoritative, the term he often uses is al-hujja min al-qurra, or al-hujja min al-qara. Qara is another jam' of qari. Al-hujja min al-qurra, none of them read this, and so therefore it's not permissible. He says, I think he said, يُحْذَرُ قِرَاءَتُهَا وَمَحْذُورٌ هِيَ مَحْذُورَةٌ قِرَاءَتُهَا, or something like that. I don't remember the exact wording that he used, but basically he says that this is not permissible to read because it goes completely outside of what the reliable established Qurra are reading. So you could read Maliki, you could read Maliki, you might prefer this, you might prefer that, and Qurra would then exercise their preference on one or the other. But if it went outside of the well-known readings, and this is where the oral transmission comes into play. If it goes outside of the well-known readings, he would reject it outright. He says very clearly that basically it's not permissible to read a recitation that goes outside and he says this all over the place in his tafsir, that if it's not recited by any of the well-known reciters, it's not allowed to recite it. So this is basically how with this example you see that there's only these two possibilities, number one. And in fact, if we just look at I mean, you brought with this discussion, you brought a lot of things into play. This brings into play the discussion on what are al-ahruf al-sab'ah, what is the relationship of al-ahruf al-sab'ah to the Mus'haf of Uthman and the Rasm of the Mus'haf. And you made a point, and this is a very important point, because a number of scholars have pointed this out. There is no disagreement about the Rasm of the Quran. The Rasm of the Quran is mutawatir. And this is well substantiated also by the manuscript evidence. For the manuscript masahif that go back even to the 1st century of Islam, the 2nd century of Islam, we have actually pieces of masahif, sometimes big pieces, sometimes small pieces that have survived from the first 3 centuries of Islam. So we're talking about even pre-Ibn Mujahid. These masahif, you see that they're very clearly, they do adhere to the Uthmani mushaf. An individual scribe might make a mistake here or there, but as a corpus, as a body, all of these masahif are very clearly adhering to the text that was produced by the Committee of the Companions under Uthman. So this is undeniably, goes back straight to the time of Uthman. This rasam, it's true, it can be read in a number of different ways. But on top of that, we find, even though it can be read in a number of different ways, so we have reciters reading Malik and Malik, as you rightly pointed out. But in Surah An-Nas, even though the rasam is the same, so in Surah An-Nas, when you read Malik and Nas, in terms of what readings is the rasam, the skeletal text of the Mus'haf, it's open to the reading Malik. It is open to the reading Malik the same way that Maliki Yawmiddin in Surah Al-Fatiha is. But nobody reads Malik and Nas. They all read Malik and Nas. So this is an indication that it's not, the fact that the rasam was written in that fashion doesn't mean that everyone was just engaging in a free-for-all. Otherwise, you would have people saying, yeah, I feel like we're reciting Malik and Nas. So the recitation tradition was basically, you had well-known reciters, and actually there was more than 7, there was more than 10, but these 7 or these 10 are generally speaking amongst the most famous. They're generally speaking amongst the most famous, and their qira'at were amongst the most widespread. And so Ibn Mujahid created a closed system with these 7, and then others continued carrying on transmitting some of these other ones, and so we end up with Ibn al-Jazari saying it should be these 10, because these 3 are not far off in terms of being widespread. But when you go through the Mus'haf, in most places where they differ, most places where the Qur'an differ about reading a word, you have 2 possibilities. So it's not an endless number of possibilities. So generally speaking, whether you have 7 Qur'a, whether you have 10 Qur'a, or whether you have 70 Qur'a, which before Ibn Mujahid, basically that's what actually was the case. You basically had more or less 70 Qur'a, or more even.
In terms of major people who were recognized.
In terms of Qur'a who are known to have their own Qira'ah in the sense of reading system that we described.
Yeah.
Even if you had 70 Qur'a, the end result would basically be a lot like we have now, because there's not an endless number of possibilities, right? Hypothetically,
there's an endless number of combinations because there's so many individual words in the Quran.
Right, but in terms of variants in any given verse,
yeah,
usually you have 2 variants. Sometimes you have 3, 4, or 5. Although those cases are not nearly as common. It happens, but even then, when you have more than 2, oftentimes those different variants that are more than 2 are strictly pronunciation issues. So, for example, in Surah Al-Ikhlas, most reciters read kufu'an, some read kuf'an, Hafs and Asim reads kufu'an, and so forth. And you actually have some other possibilities. All of these are strictly a reflection of different dialects of the Arabs pronouncing the same word. So sometimes you get more than 2 possibilities, but these are more than 2 possibilities that are just they're just a reflection of different accents of different dialects in the Arabic language. I mean, this is the same way that, you know, if I was going to quote to someone something that you said, Dr. Sohaib, I wouldn't try and imitate your Scottish accent, right?
Fair.
I mean, I might for comedic effect. I don't think I could do a good job of it, but generally speaking, nobody would say, "Oh, you misquoted Dr. Sohaib because he doesn't speak in that strange hybrid Alabama American accent that you have."
Yeah.
Nobody says, "Oh, you misquoted him." Nobody says, "Oh, you know, you are misreading Hamlet because you don't speak with a 16th century English, specifically from Stratford-on-Avon accent." And that would be absurd.
Yeah.
It would be absurd. So a lot of the differences that you see in the Qira'at, they're just a reflection of the differences in the different Arabic dialects.
Yeah.
As for differences that have an impact on meaning, I don't know what their exact number is. I have no doubt they're less than it's somewhere less than 1,000 words. It might be even much less than that. Out of 80,000 total words in the Quran, roughly. That's an estimate, but the number is somewhere around there. There's about 80,000 words in the Quran, of which you have maybe 1,000 words that are different, and a lot of those differences are just reflections of different pronunciations. In terms of the words that are actually read differently, it's actually a limited number of words. That limited number of words has a limited number of variants. This is even though if we were to throw the door wide open and say, just look at a mushaf and figure out how this verse could be possibly read, you would actually end up with a lot more variants, which is an indication that there was a very strict oral tradition transmitting not just the text, but how it's supposed to be read.
And there was that aspect of what he was calling dabt, like in hadith, like these scholars, these imams of recitation, they were choosing the things that they consider to be strongest in terms of these characteristics that are described. Okay, in particular, you know, obviously agreeing with the mushaf is not really a matter of choice. It's you know, by this point things have been eliminated that are not agreeing with the mushaf, so they're not really dealing with them. Naql mutawatir mustafid, yeah, so they might be choosing the things that they deem to be actually best attested, most famous, and so on, right?
Yes.
So the mufassirin will be doing that as well. But to a large extent, there was a role of those who were the experts in grammar to say, we prefer this one in terms of how its clarity of meaning, its clarity of, you know, it doesn't involve, this other reading has got a certain ishkal in it, which we don't really, you know, you're not going to prefer that.
This is an important point. Almost all discussions of the shurut of Qira'at mention these three conditions, and obviously the third one is the one that is differed over. So here, Imam Ibn Juzayy has expressed it as naql mutawatir or mustafid. You know, you'll find others saying sihat as-sanad, and obviously the most popular call will be that it's tawatur. It has to be mutawatir. But the question that raises, and obviously the scholars who take this view, they have explanations that they offer for it. But if something is mutawatir from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this second shart, موافقته لكلام العرب ولو على بعض الوجوه, is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam not Arabic?
Yeah, it would become
It would be redundant.
The reading itself would be the proof of the Arabic language.
Yeah, basically, the reading itself would be proof of its being muwafiq li kalam al-Arab, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is Arab. And if it was mutawatir from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we would have yaqeen that it is from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right?
Even arguably, that would override the mushaf point, because
well,
if it remains
you could. I was gonna mention that there's a stronger response to that than there is to the second shart, because with that what you can say is, suppose that it's mutawatir to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it could still be mansukh.
Sure, yeah.
Meaning it could be
So
mansukh
the point
al-tilawa.
you're pointing to the
And
fact
so-
that the mushaf represents the final, like the final thing that
the final version of the text of Quran.
Yeah.
Because we know abrogation of recited verses used to happen. I know that there are people who doubt this, but we can deal with crazy people later. There's people who question that, but the fact that abrogation of verses after they were revealed would happen is so well attested that there's no doubt about it. So the question of muwafaqat al-mushaf might come up still if we were to say that the recitation was reported from the Prophet ﷺ, which is mutawatir. I mean, I'll use this as an example of it's difficult to say.
What I'm pointing to is that maybe even in some cases, there are some readings which can be sort of read onto the mushaf, but with just a little bit of struggle. And we're not talking about where this like whole extra phrase or something. Whole extra phrase is ruled out by the mushaf. But as I say, وَلَوْ احْتِمَالًا, right? So even...
Right. He acts at وَلَوْ احْتِمَالًا, but usually human.
Yeah.
Usually they mention that. Usually they mention that in the first chapter. That it has
so ihtimal could be even sort of quite sometimes with a bit of difficulty when letters read on top of another letter.
Right. This by the way, that actually is a very important point, because the idea of muwafaqat al-mushaf ihtimalan, it's very clear that different qurra had different approaches to this. Different qurra were willing to be more liberal in the idea of muwafaqat al-mushaf, and others weren't. And so this is why you find that Abu Ubaid will say, well, I'm not going to read this. I mean, his book is lost, but we have quotes from it still in secondary sources. He'll say, well, this reading here, I don't approve of it because it goes against the mushaf. And he'll mention the argument for it being muhtamil, and then he'll say it's not. I don't think it is because of this. So you can see that it's not this simple, straightforward thing of tawatur.
Yeah. So actually, one of the participants has brought up, he's brought up the word ikhtiyar. It'd be good to shine some light on that. So I was already talking about this point about choosing from what has been attested. Okay. Yeah. So ikhtiyar is probably an aspect of qira'at which is one of the things which is not looked at enough in this level that I was talking about, right? It's one of these things which sort of glossed over in a lot of the way that people talk about qira'at, even when scholars are talking about it. When you look into it more, I think that's one of the areas which is quite fascinating. But it shines a light also on how the early scholars saw the qira'at. Actually, maybe we can comment further by looking at his discussion around Maliki Yawmiddin, because I was just looking up the page number. And the reason I wanted to draw attention to that is to notice two things, just very in brief. Okay. First of all, that in a way he is recognizing the existence of both the readings and giving them respect, right? So he hasn't at any point said this one is the Quran and the other one is not the Quran, right? So the fact is it's become very comfortable, not just become, I mean, it was already very comfortable for them to say some of the Qurra read it this way, some of the Qurra read it that way. They didn't get in a panic about that, like, it was very understood that that's what the Quran is, right? Yes. So some of the scholars use the word a multiform text, right? So he's comfortable with that. At the same time, he's also comfortable with, after presenting this, let's just have a quick scan of it. Okay, Maliki قرأه الجماعة بغير الألف, right? So I think that's 5 out of the 7 readers. And then if you add the 3 on top, so Abu Ja'far is also with those 5, so it becomes 6 out of the 10, right? بغير ألف من الملك وقرأ عاصم الكسائي, okay, and then to that you would add Yaqub al-Khalaf, becomes 4, بالألف. Okay, so then he talks about the meanings. And then he says, وَقِرَاءَةُ الْجَمَاعَةِ أَرْجَحُ مِنْ ثَلَاثَةِ أَوْجُهٍ. So this is the qira'ah of Nafi' and others as Maliki. Then he gives 3 reasons. Now we won't dwell on these reasons. But then he just basically says, it is arjah. So he's he's okay with saying that. He's okay with both recognizing the value of the qira'at and that they should be respected, but still have the sense that, okay, we're trying to do dabt in a sense. We're trying to actually determine the best.
This is interesting because this point he makes tarjih of one qira'ah over another. By the way, note here what he says. This point here. وقد رويت القراءتان في الحديث عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. This is actually.
Let's just get this. وقد قرئ ملك بوجوه كثيرة إلا أنها شاذة. This is a point that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Note he says رويت القراءتان في الحديث عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. This is actually a very important point. You will find that for the early Qur'an, looking at what was reported from the Prophet ﷺ in hadith, hadith, حدثني فلان and fulan and fulan. The Prophet ﷺ read this way, acted a very important role in their ikhtiyar. And so, that might seem odd if you say, well, all of the qira'at if all the qira'at are mutawatira, then what is the point of making ikhtiyar on the basis of ahad hadith, which it is a question. Why would you do that? It wouldn't make any sense. So one thing that you will find is that they do in fact do this. One thing that needs to be understood, and this point here, he's making tarjih of qira'at, and he's a fairly late scholar. He's an 8th century scholar. You will find other scholars starting from around this time, around the same century that he's in. Not only do they insist that the qira'at are mutawatira, just having a preference in the qira'at is something that they find scandalous. So Abu Hayyan, who is basically contemporary of Ibn Juzayy, he would be absolutely shocked at what Ibn Juzayy is saying. How dare you?
Abu Hayyan, you said, it's just because the sound was cutting. Abu Hayyan al-Andalusi, yeah.
Abu Hayyan al-Andalusi.
Maybe they're neighbors as well.
Yeah. Al-Andalusi is
right.
He's also an Andalusian scholar from the same period as Ibn Juzayy, basically, although he shifted to Egypt. He is a very strong advocate of the view that the qira'at are entirely mutawatira, and so when he mentions what past scholars, even though it's very common in earlier works, when they have these types of discussions, he just rubbishes it. He says, "What is this? This is all from the Prophet ﷺ. How dare you say that this reading is better than that reading?" And this comes back to understanding, where does ikhtiyar come from in the first place? Why are Qur'an doing ikhtiyar? Why don't they say, I will read everything? Madam annahu kullu mutawatir, I should read everything. Today I will read, for example, Asim should say, today I will read this way, Maliki, tomorrow I will read Maliki, and just and just keep alternating. In fact, that was something that's interesting, is that of the Qur'an. By the way, what was the ikhtiyar that he attributed to Al-Kisai here for Maliki?
Sorry.
He puts him under those who read Maliki, correct?
Yeah.
He puts him with Asim, preferring Maliki. But there are actually reports from Al-Kisai that he preferred Maliki, and then later on he said, "Okay, you know what? Read either one." Which is interesting, because you see that sometimes, but this is one of the actual examples. He originally said, "Read Maliki," and this is what he would recite and he would teach. And then later on, he's reported to have retracted that, saying, "Read either one. Read either one." So he's basically sort of on the fence as to which one he prefers. Now, here's the thing. One thing that's very important to understand is that originally the Quran was revealed in, would say, one harf. And then towards the end of the Prophet ﷺ's life, he asked as a rukhsa for his ummah to be allowed to read in 7 ahruf. This is a huge discussion. What are ahruf? What do they mean? Are they really 7, or is 7 intended to be for the meaning of kathra? There's a host of different I don't want to really deep into that. There's a lot of hadiths of this. It's been reported from about a dozen companions. There's a scholar, Abdulaziz al-Qadi, who has a 150-page book just devoted to gathering together the hadith al-Ahruf Sabah. Gathering all the different hadith from the Sahaba with their different wordings and their chains. He doesn't even go that deep into discussing the different narrations and their chains. But just to collect them, it was 150 pages. So it's obviously it's a big discussion, because aside from these quotes from companions, you have quotes from tabi'in, you have other historical evidence that helps give a picture on what exactly the ahruf are, and still, scholars have differed about that, about a lot of details in terms of ahruf. But in short, what can be said that originally the Quran was revealed to be recited in one fashion. Then the ahruf were revealed to make transmission and learning the Quran easy. Because what happened is at the very end of the Prophet ﷺ's life, he's in these 10 years in Medina, the population of Medina, I think, was said to be something like 20,000 or 30,000. So there's a certain number of companions in Medina. It might even be less than that. I'm not sure now. Then all of a sudden, towards the very end of the Prophet ﷺ's life, hundreds of thousands, at least 100,000, a few hundred thousand Arabs across the Arabian Peninsula enter into Islam, and it happens very quickly. So what happens is that over the course of that 10 years, the Prophet ﷺ was in Medina. He had a system. He had Qur'at who were assigned. He himself was receiving Quran and teaching Quran and dictating the Quran to his scribes. So his scribes were writing it down. His Qur'at were memorizing it, particularly the main ones were memorizing it, and then turning around and teaching it to others. I mean, obviously, the Prophet ﷺ was a very busy man. He had a lot of obligations, a lot of responsibilities. So he was at the top of sort of this pyramid, the system that was set up for teaching and disseminating the Quran amongst the companions. But this one was set up for Medina with a large number of specialists there in Medina and a smaller community. All of a sudden, you have hundreds of thousands of people are entering into Islam, and you need them to learn the Quran. Particularly, these are people who are largely illiterate. Particularly, the Bedouins are illiterate. Illiteracy amongst them is even more widespread than it is amongst the townspeople. So you need them to learn the Quran. You need them to learn it easily. On top of the fact that they're illiterate, because of the differences in dialects, the Quraysh might use certain words that are unknown to other tribes. And so they would use in place of that word another word. So to ensure that Quran spreads amongst them, and that Islam spreads amongst them, and that it settles in their heart, and this is very important because we know that the Prophet ﷺ is going to die just a year later, and many of the Arabs will actually apostate. So this was not just like, oh, this would be nice. No, this was essential. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives this rukhsa for the Quran to be recited in multiple fashions. And as I said, there's like 40 different opinions as to what exactly the 7 ahruf entail. In Uthman's, obviously there's a lot to be said, but basically we're just going to skip. Abu Bakr compiled the Musaf, alhamdulillah, to ensure that it's preserved. Then in Uthman's time, people are getting confused because there's so many variations in recitation. He says, okay, Hudayfa comes to him and says, okay, you have to do something about this. So he gathers together Zayd with a committee of people working under him to copy the Masahif, to issue authoritative Masahif to the major population centers in the Muslim world, so that people can now have a reference point for their recitations. These Masahif that they copied, which we talked about earlier, and we said that these are extremely well tested from historical evidence in our tradition, as well as the manuscript tradition, that the Uthmani Mus'haf is extremely well preserved, and the Turasim is extremely well preserved. These are then sent out. They're made the authoritative point for recitation, and that eliminates a lot of variations, but it doesn't eliminate all variations. And so we have the rise of both the these mashhur qira'at that agree with the Musahif, as well as shadh qira'at that are shadh. They're not very well attested. They're not very well widespread. Maybe the grammarians also disapprove of them, etc., etc. That are also in agreement with these Musahif. But the amount of variation is much less than what it was before he sent out these Musahif. So At-Tahawi, and this is the point that I want to make about the Ahruf, because there's a whole lot of other points, but this is the one I want to highlight. At-Tahawi says that, look, this was a rukhsa. The rukhsa had an illah. The illah was that illiteracy was widespread, and these other things that I described as well. You could throw those in there, but I think the one that he particularly highlighted was illiteracy. So once illiteracy becomes widespread, the rukhsa is no longer needed. It's like tayammum. When you have water, you make wudu. You don't make tayammum.
So this is At-Tahawi making this point. This is his reasoning.
At-Tahawi is making this point about the ahruf. So he says that this actually highlights a very important point. When you have a rukhsa, what's the opposite of rukhsa? It's an azima. For those who are familiar with usul fiqh, the opposite of rukhsa is azima. What is the azima? The azima is to recite in the preferred fashion of the Prophet ﷺ.
So the azima in general terms is the thing that is doing it in the normal way, the proper way, the ideal way, as opposed to something we should just allow to do, a dispensation, a permission,
right.
Is a rukhsa.
So the Sohaib of Uthman do, I would say, like 95% of the work, or even 99% of the work, in bringing us to that azima.
Yeah, seeking after the best recitation that you can find that is the most.
As the Prophet ﷺ was reciting at the end of his life, sort of the final version of the text, the ideal version of the text, as opposed to the allowances.
Yeah,
and so this is why in the recitations of the Quran, where there are these variations, the Qurra exercise ikhtiyar because they're attempting to determine the azima. And someone who very explicitly says this is Ibn Ashur in his Muqaddimat of his Tafsir. He says that basically that where you have these different recitations. He mentions this point that a lot of later scholars problematize the fact that earlier scholars were engaging in ikhtiyar, and some of them are even scandalized by it. Who are you to say that one reading is better than another? Yeah. And so he said, hold on, let's just discuss this with a cool head. Number one, some verses of the Quran can be better than other verses. I don't think I made that point. I'm making that. But that is in and of itself a discussion that scholars have had. That can one verse be better than the other verses, like Ayatul Kursi, and the sort of logical ramifications. So he mentions this point. He says, yes, one recitation could be ablagh than another recitation, and that doesn't mean that the other recitation takes the Quran outside of being mu'jiz. But the one that is greater in balagha is obviously going to be greater in fulfilling the ijaz, the sort of fulfilling the ijaz balaghi of the Quran. Yeah. That it is in fact a linguistic miracle.
So this is the kind of thing that you're pointing at just now is the kind of thing that what I was trying to say at the beginning, that there are things that people who are currently on this level can find some of these things uncomfortable because there seems to be an implication about the Quran's preservation. Are you saying something about uncertainty in the Quran's preservation and so on? Would you say that the answer to that is basically no? It's just a question of how you have conceptualized what it means that the Quran is preserved and the role of the scholars in doing that and carrying that forward. That we still need an account which is therefore going to sort of make this clearer so that people don't get confused.
Okay, good. So one of the questions that comes up is, for example, this example that I mentioned about the different dialects and how this creates different pronunciations. the Prophet ﷺ knows that Arabs pronounce the Quran in different ways. They pronounce words in different ways. And he's specifically taken permission for this.
Yeah.
Is it necessary then, after he explains that, this is the rule, this is what you are allowed, that every Sahabi needs to then ask him, in my dialect, I say kuf, I don't say kufu. So should I read kuf'an as opposed to kufu'an? He doesn't need that because the Prophet ﷺ has already given him permission. And so some scholars have basically said that, yes, some of these aspects, Ibn al-Hajib highlights this particularly with the Hayat al-Ada, and I think Ibn Taymiyyah also highlighted in Hayat al-Ada, but the point is relevant here as well, that these sorts of aspects are not necessarily all going back to the Prophet ﷺ. It's just the Sahaba reciting according to the different dialects. And that really is the larger portion of the differences in Qira'at. That still leaves the question of differences in the Qira'at that where there are differences in meaning.
Yeah. So that leads. So there has been a kind of a development over time in terms of attitudes towards. And I might draw up something from a thesis here, just to sort of pin our discussion on. So round about this page 221, when I talk about the Qira'at, I describe how there is. This term Qira'at mutawatira, which is perhaps best just understood in terms of what are the canonical Qira'at. Okay, and then, I talk about how there's a kind of development over time in terms of the way that people talk about them, right?
Yes.
So, where is it? Okay, so I referenced Shadi Nasir here, just to keep everyone happy. There was a marked shift from early approaches to variant readings to a developed consensus of both reciters and usul scholars that there is an equal status as Quran for all the 10 readings. Okay, and I said that this shift is reflected in the Tafsir tradition. So I talked earlier about Al-Tabari. There's an earlier section in chapter 2 about Al-Tabari, and to show the way that he looks at Qira'at and the way he's treating them. To where it became taboo almost to prefer some readings over others, let alone to criticize them. And I quoted here, well, at some point I made a reference to Samin al-Halabi, who of course is a student of Abu Hayyan. So you've indicated that trend of being very defensive about anything that is narrated in the 7 Qira'at. So then I said later scholars would mount a staunch defense of any reading from the 7 in particular, responding to the critiques of early exegetes, especially linguists and grammarians. Interesting exception being Shawkani. But then what I've said is that along the line, so I don't want to read through all of this, but I do, but I don't have time, is that the logical conclusion of the canonical and pluralistic approach, okay, which we kind of indicated has become the popular thing later, is to expect them all to be taken into account in the interpretation of any particular verse. Right, so we have this. There's a series of master's theses you might have seen came out of Gaza, where they try to do tafsir of the Quran through, with all the qira'at in play, as an active thing. So basically what happens is, and then you've got the recent, as I mentioned it before, the Bridges translation of the Quran, right? So here's. Yeah, so that kind of, this new translation of the Quran sort of belongs in this mindset, which says the multiple qira'at are actually there as, as a way of enriching the meaning, as a way of multiplying the meaning in a particular verse. So it's as if to say, Allah Azza wa Jal then has both revealed that He is Maliki Yawmiddin, and He's also revealed Maliki Yawmiddin, because both of those statements are intended to be made here. But instead of revealing them as 2 separate verses, He has revealed them in a way that is going to be sort of compacted into the same verse. Now, I would say, this is my personal opinion, that actually, that works in a lot of cases. That probably has a lot of validity to it and explains a higher wisdom behind the existence of the ahruf in the first place, and tells us something about the nature of those ahruf, which should be part of the equation and the thought process around understanding all those narrations and hadiths that you alluded to. And it is something which is part of the reality of the qira'at, which should be appreciated and should be kept very much in mind. It might not apply to all meaning differences and all variations, right? So sometimes it's more convincing and sometimes it's less convincing. So
Yes.
it's a matter where there's some kind of tafsil to be made there. So if they didn't see this in the early time, that we should just see, this is a miracle that there are multiple ways of saying this, Malik and Malik. But then in the very modern times, because our sort of shift in thinking and this sort of increase in looking for new ways of describing the miracles of the Quran, people may start to talk about it in this way.
Sometimes you will end up exaggerating things. I mean, we've seen that. Obviously, this is actually a compelling discussion. This is not like some of the silly things that we've seen, like the 19 thing and some of the other odd things that you get people out there saying that, oh, this is a miracle.
But basically that point, the point about saying that the multiple qira'at are a miracle of the Quran, is a statement that may have some legs to run on, but one should be cautious, because whenever you introduce a sort of new thing that's a miracle, that could end up, people base their faith on a certain conception of that.
On that, yes.
And then
I think one thing that can
they realize that
definitely be said,
when they realize that it's not being conveyed quite accurately to them, they might then lose the faith in the thing that the miracle was supposed to establish for them. Like what's happened with scientific miracles. I think that's a good comparison to bring up. I'm actually fine with the idea that there are things mentioned in the Quran which realities which correspond to things which we only discover later in many centuries later. So you can call that scientific miracles if you want, but when a whole industry is based around that,
that created a lot of problems. So, and
now people are tumbling down from that sandcastle in the sky that people had built for them. So that's why I think it's important that we do have an account that really just is realistic in terms of the history, the background, the nature of our scholarship, our tradition. And so ironically, so when people are maybe talking about rewording or kind of recasting the narrative around Qira'at, sometimes they're accused of being modernist, or they're accused of being influenced by Orientalists or something like that. I mean, I don't want to get into the do's and fro's of such debate.
It brings up an interesting question. I don't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Before I forget this point, it actually brings up an interesting sort of question that is pertinent to this discussion and many, many other discussions in our tradition. There's sometimes you have a development that takes place in the tradition or in the narrative. It's simply, we could say maybe it's a deviation, that the finer points of the original reality was sort of lost. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you have things where originally, scholars differed, and maybe their view of this issue was muddled, and then later scholarship actually had a more refined view of that topic. I'll give just a small example. This is an individual example in Tafsir, and we were discussing this, not too long ago. Early Mufassirin said, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, from the Sohaib and the Tabi'in, and this is the view of At-Tabari, as well as also some other classical Mufassirin, before the narrative shifts very clearly in the other direction, said that the son that Ibrahim alayhi salam was going to slaughter was Ishaq. And then later on, you have a clear shift that takes place where the majority view becomes Ismail. And I would say that the reason that shift took place is because the arguments for it being Ismail are more sophisticated, more well thought out, and actually reflect a better analysis of the text of the Quran, as well as external evidences like looking at possible tahrif in the Torah and what have you. So here you find an example where a shift from what was the predominant view earlier to a new view, or not a new view, but what was originally a minority view then becoming the predominant view, is actually a result of refinement in the scholarship. It's not a degeneration. So not every new development is necessarily, and I said I'm using the term new here very loosely. Nobody. I mean, someone might take this out of context and say that, oh, you said that bid'ah could be a good thing in the deen. That's not what I'm suggesting. But a new predominant narrative could actually be a refinement of problems in a view that existed before. And so you have to be careful not to simply dismiss something old, assuming that those that came later have actually refined what those who said earlier didn't get. But at the same time, you have to be careful not to dismiss something that's new because it's new, or it wasn't very prominent in the tradition. And so, this question of how to reconcile multiplicity of qira'at and the earlier approach which you mentioned of there's generally a preference for trying to choose the ideal qira'ah, and then later on there's a preference for trying to say that basically all these qira'at are equal and we have to sort of show the ijaz of the Quran through all of them or something along those lines.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that this is entirely wrong just because it's a development.
Yeah.
So and I think that's an important point.
So that, I mean, in a way, like again, to go back to promoting my thesis, in a way that I've seen that, to be honest, it's not really clear to me that going with a reductive interpretation in tafsir when it comes to the qira'at is the right thing to do, or to go the pluralistic way is the right thing to do, but that we need to actually talk more about what is involved in each process, and then realize that mufassirin could go here or there in various cases. When they say al-aslu fil qira'at at-tawafuq fil ma'na, so various people have said that the default expectation is when there's multiple qira'at, we should see them as having the same meaning, or we should lean towards that interpretation which allows us to find the qira'at not disagreeing with each other. What I'm saying is that this very modern or very recent approach is to almost go the other direction, which is to say we want to find the differences between them because that will demonstrate the miracle. But that was not what was going on in the past. And it's okay. It's not unreasonable to present a new point of view, but I just think people should know that it is a new point of view and be very clear that it's a new point of view. So to recognize that I'm not.
And again, I think historical context is also helpful. Meaning, clearly, if you're a qari who's in this era where you don't have a fixed system of qira'at, meaning you're pre-Ibn Mujahid, there is no standard that these 7 qira'at should be the 7 qira'at, or these 10 qira'at should be the 10 qira'at. Yeah. It's natural that you're going to be much more concerned about it. Because that is sort of the question of the hour. Which reading should I read? Later on, as time passes on, and that's sort of now a settled question, it's natural then that scholars will then start exploring from different avenues. Yeah. Irrespective of how right or how wrong it is, that the fact that in terms of the specifics of their conclusions, the fact that they're exploring different avenues because of their historical context is now the question of, well, how should this be read? Even though there's multiple qira'at, it's sort of a closed question.
Yeah. So I have a lot of sympathy for exploring new, taking things in new avenues in tafsir as well. So I'm very open to that. I just think it's very important for people to know.
It just needs to be done properly.
Yeah. And so not to use words like that against your mukhalif who might actually be trying to get a bit more in terms of the traditional mindset or the early mindset. That doesn't make you modernist, that you're talking about.
Here would be, it's very important that, you know, that anyone who's going to employ some, basically what you termed the pluralistic approach to interpreting qira'at, that he do so in a way that he's mindful that in the process he doesn't actually undermine everything that we know about, or that we should know about the history of the qira'at and how it developed in the first place.
And tafsir as well, you know, that basically calling everyone before as having misunderstood when they dealt with the qira'at the way that they did.
Right, which is good. I'm glad you actually mentioned that, because I recently just came across an example. I don't remember which verse it was. Ibn Mujahid critiqued a particular recitation. Okay, so this is literally, we're talking about Ibn Mujahid. This is not like this is not like, you know,
the Seven Eyes,
Professor John Jacob Jingleheimer Smith in the College of Ministry and Science in, you know, in some Western university. This is literally the man who canonized the 7 qira'at. He critiqued one of the qira'at on something or another. I don't remember now which verse was. He's critiquing one of the qurra. Later, Abu Hayyan quotes him. He says that هذا ينجر إلى الكفر. And you see how, because Abu Hayyan is so bought into what was his understanding of the development of the qira'at, that he's willing to disregard, you know, the obvious sort of proof is in the pudding, as they say. It's obvious then if Ibn Mujahid didn't see the qira'at this way, you really have to ask yourself, well, when did you start seeing the qira'at in this way?
Right. Yeah, so inshallah there's a lot more that can be said, that can be clarified, but I think it's helped just to put things into a bit of perspective. And importantly, I think that when we're studying tafsir, to be ready to see things in the way that the mufassirin are seeing them in whatever era that we are reading. So Ibn Juzayy is a post-canonical mufassir, right? So we're not reading a Tabari here. We're reading someone who recognizes the 7, is dealing with the 7, and sometimes a little bit beyond. We are seeing a respect for the qira'at, but we're also seeing a willingness to indicate a tarjih. He's looking at the different meanings involved. So it's fairly straightforward. When you are reading tafsir a lot, you develop this kind of feeling and sense and appreciation. When you don't read any tafsir, but you've maybe, you know, you're dealing in sort of another zone, which is polemics and maybe arguing with people about the Bible's corruption, and then they're pointing things at the Quran's corruption, and then we're throwing things back on that level. It's understandable that you've got a certain arsenal of arguments.
And also another thing that happens is, aside from people who are involved in polemics, sometimes what happens is that people study tafsir, but they study it in a very narrow way. So, for example, I studied Jalalain and its Hawashi, and then I study Al-Baydawi with its Hawashi, and that's pretty much it. Or maybe some other works that are derivative of that sort of segment of the tradition. So I don't know what At-Tabari said. I don't know what Ibn Juzayy said. I don't know what Ibn Atiyah said, and so these other scholars said. And so, if, for example, you know, you'll have scholars who ascribe to this sort of view that Abu Hayyan does. So if somebody's only read certain works of the tradition and doesn't know the broader tradition, he will also be shocked by these things, even though he might have been, you know, reading tafsir for a long time. And I think that happens as well.
Yeah. No, so yeah, of course, I'm not the least bit suggesting Abu Hayyan is not reading tafsir. But
no, I'm not. I'm not talking about Abu Hayyan, but I'm saying if somebody's only reading Abu Hayyan, only reading Abu Hayyan.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Alain and his Hawashi, and they never go beyond that. He might think that he knows tafsir really well, but he doesn't realize that there's actually a host of different approaches, and each of these scholars have their own perspective and their own historical context from which they're working with the Qira'at.
Yeah. So yeah, it just helps to maybe okay, maybe someone can give you a quick answer, and that would be great. And maybe in this hour or so, we have given some quick answers. But it's such a vast topic, really. There's so many different aspects, and as you indicated when you're talking about the ahruf hadiths, there's so much that can be said, so many investigations and points of view. We need some more things to be written. I hope that you will write on this. We know some colleagues and scholars who are working on things, and inshallah will get published in due course, and that will help a lot, really, to frame the discussions and take things forward. In the meantime, for us as Talibatul Ilm, I hope that we just relax a little bit about this subject. We've got 14 centuries of kind of, very, thorough scholarship, which at the same time has always admitted for a certain appreciation of plurality, appreciation of ambiguity. I know that the word is so terrifying for so many people, but the modern mind is most at unease at ambiguity. I know some scholars have written about, some academics have written about this recently. But it is actually we are products of modernity, like it or not, and that's why we react sometimes negatively towards things that in the past, real scholars and imams and mufassirin, they were at ease with, because of the extent of their knowledge, but also the soundness of their conception of things. We are products of all sorts of things in our background, including, sometimes our slightly Sunday school version of Islamic education. And, we benefit from these things, but we shouldn't confuse sometimes a simplified account for the sophisticated scholarly account, because, it's important to be able to talk to people on their level and to give people an answer that will just be straightforward for them. But what we say to our children is one thing. What we say to this, teenagers or very beginning Talabatul Ilm is one thing. But what is investigated on further levels might be something else. Might be something which, is you can't throw people in the deep end on all these subjects. You've got to make it very straightforward. Maybe don't tell people there's no difference in vowel or letter anywhere in the world. Maybe don't tell them that. Slightly adjust that. Just adjust that point. Or say it in a way that doesn't become untrue.
It's funny you mentioned that, because literally just yesterday I got a question about obviously the vast majority of Masahif are printed according to Riwayat Hafs and Asim. And you're probably well aware of this. The Masahif that are printed in the Arab world are printed with the word Da'af written as Da'af, the Fatha.
Yeah.
And the ones that are printed in the subcontinent are printed with Da'af.
Yeah.
Dhamma. The reason for this difference between the Masahif is because those who did Dhabt with the Fatha are actually doing Dhabt according to what Hafs narrated from Asim.
So this is this one specific ayah, right? Ayah 54.
I think, yeah, it's in one specific ayah.
Yeah.
It's in one specific ayah, the word Da'af is mentioned.
It's Room 54. I was just looking up, yeah.
Yeah. So, Hafs reports from Asim, his Qira'at. Asim actually read Da'af. This is how he actually read. He did not read Da'af. Hafs himself, in this one place, he exercised ikhtiyar and chose to read Da'af. There are a couple of reasons for that. I'm not going to get to them, but I'll say to say that Da'af is actually, this reflects the dialect of Banu Tamim. And Da'af actually reflects the dialect of Quraysh. And there's actually, well, I'll go ahead and say it. There's a hadith reported from the Prophet ﷺ as well, that he actually read it Da'af, which would be supported the fact that this is Lughat Quraysh anyways, most likely. So Hafs realizing that said, well, I'd rather, this might be how I genuinely pronounce this word, but I'd like to read it like the Prophet ﷺ. So he read it Da'af. So, even with the Masahif that are written according to one riwayah, people run into this and then they think, oh my God, what's going on here? When it's really, and the problem is just that, they've learned about the Quran in a way that is depending on what exactly they've learned, either flawed or incomplete. And so it's just a question of educating yourself. It's just a question of educating yourself. And I think, I think maybe it would be best if if just sort of in wrapping up, we just sort of highlight the idea of preservation of the Quran, so people have a big picture sort of view of what is at stake. Some of the things that we've already talked about. We have the Sohaib of Uthman. This was put together with the approval of the companions, with the companion in charge, Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit is not just any companion. He was one of the most important scribes of the Prophet ﷺ writing the Quran. He was also one of the Sahaba who memorized the entire Quran from the Prophet ﷺ in his lifetime. Because many Sahaba actually completed because obviously the revelation of the Quran was an ongoing process, and they were fighting and they were going out to battles and things like that. So not everyone was full-time doing Hifz Quran. So you had many, but not all of them finished the memorization of the Quran in the lifetime of the Prophet. Zayd one of them, and Zayd also wrote the Quran. Zayd also collected the Quran for Bakr, going around getting attestation from Sahaba orally, as well as gathering the written materials and comparing all of them, and then copying those with a group of people with the approval of the companions. This was done in the time of the Sahaba with the approval of the Sahaba. It has been rigorously preserved. The Rasam of Uthman has been rigorously preserved. There are places where there are variants that result from different ways that you can read that Rasam. Those variants, majority of them, are a reflection of different Arabic dialects that don't affect the meaning. Where the words do affect the meaning, meaning the word Malik is not the same as the word Malik in meaning. But largely speaking, even then, the lesson from Maliki Yawmiddin and Maliki Yawmiddin is overall not very different, is it?
No.
I mean, it doesn't change the meaning of Surah Al-Fatiha. It doesn't really change the meaning of it. Does change the meaning of the verse, but at the same time, it really doesn't. And the reality is, vast majority of the readings, the reading variants, particularly the authorized variants, are like this. And those are just a few hundred words in the Quran, anyways, out of some 80,000 words, whatever the number is. So I mean, it's not so. So if somebody asks, well, is the Quran preserved? I say, of course it's preserved. We have it. We know how to read it, or we meticulously preserved how to read it. Not only do we meticulously preserve how to read it, but we meticulously preserved the entire Arabic language from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, do you think we would have all of these poetry collections of Imr al-Qais and all of these other Jahili poets were it not Quran? Why were these collected? They were collected because you could only understand the Quran if you understand the language of the Quran. You can only understand the language of the Quran if you have a broad linguistic corpus that illustrates the meanings of and usages of the words and expressions and the grammar rules. And for that, basically, this literature had to be preserved, which was not even literature because it was an oral tradition. Literature basically means something that's written. So it's absolutely unfathomable, the civilization achievement of preserving the Quran, that not only was the text preserved, its reading tradition preserved, the pronunciations of the Arabic dialects at the time of the Prophet ﷺ were preserved. This vast corpus of Arabic literature, particularly the poetry, was preserved, which was unwritten before Islam. Then this vast dictionary literature, the Ma'ajim, which the biggest Ma'ajim, like Taj al-Urus in its critical edition is 40 big volumes. Have you ever seen a dictionary in 40 volumes? Why all of this literally was done for the sake of the Quran. Sibawayh would not have written Al-Kitab if it was not for the Quran. I mean, when was the last time you read a grammar book in English in 5 volumes? And so you have, a Persian man takes a language that had until recently had been largely unwritten and writes a 5-volume grammar for it within just a little more than a century after the Quran was revealed. Why did all of this happen? All of this happened so that the Quran's text could be preserved and its meanings could be preserved, and it could not have been preserved without all of this. And this is rather than feeling uneasy about the fact that this Orientalist here has raised a question about this, or this apostate here has said something about this verse here, or he pulled out a quote from an obscure book that I've never heard of before. Even though there are books, I mean, it's not like we're not hiding anything. This is Kitab al-Musahif of.
They're critical editions by our scholars, right? They didn't go and get makhtutat and yeah, exactly.
This has multiple prints. I mean, we're not hiding it. We're not hiding it from anyone. So the fact that someone from some bozo from here or there has pulled out a random quote that you don't know how to understand. Well, if you don't know how to understand it, other people know how to understand it. Just ask. I mean, unfortunately, you might sometimes have difficulty finding the right person to ask, but the answers are there. The answers are there. It's not something to be alarmed about. Rather than feeling uneasy, I think we as Muslims have every right. In fact, not just a right, it's our obligation, that to be grateful for these tremendous efforts that generations of the first Muslims, starting from the Sahaba, took to preserve the Quran, to preserve its language, to preserve its understanding, preserve the Sunnah, because that's part of its understanding. The efforts, the civilizational efforts that were involved in this, it's a tremendous, tremendous achievement. Every Muslim should take great pride in the preservation of the Quran. The fact that there might be individual questions that you don't know the answers to doesn't mean that the Quran is not preserved. The Quran is preserved. The proof is in the pudding. We have these massive libraries of literature that are devoted to preserving not just the Quran but its language and all of these other aspects. I mean, if this is not preservation, then pray tell me, what is preservation?
Yeah. I mean, that's really, really helpful to to sum things up in this way. And inshallah, hope that we get to hear more from you, inshallah, as you explore this topic and others. Barakallah feek. I had this hope of maybe closing by reading the rest of this bab, but I feel that the time has definitely gone over.
Definitely gone over.
So I'll postpone that to the next session, inshallah. Thanks again to Sheikh Salman, and thanks for everyone for your questions. If there's anything that we missed, then maybe we'll try to follow that up in our discussion group. Barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.